strikes later, there was a semi-submersible that I think folks here, meaning a submarine. You don't go fishing on a submarine full of drugs. And in that particular case, the first strike didn't take it out. A couple guys jumped off and swam, from what I understand, a ways away. When we struck the submarine a second time, it sunk, and then you had 2 people that you had to go get. And we had the ability to go get them. We gave them back to their host countries. That's a story that's already been out in the public. So we didn't change our protocol. It was just a different circumstance. So what people think is cavalier or cowboy about it is the exact opposite. These are the most professional Americans going through specific processes about what they can and cannot do, understanding all the authorities, all the laws of war, all the capabilities, and applying it to deter our adversaries. And by the way, there aren't many people getting in boats right now running drugs, which is the whole point. We want to stop the poisoning of the American people. The catch and release program of the pat them on the head and release.
Watch this man speak and understand that every euphemism pouring from his mouth is drenched in blood. Every careful word a calculated attempt to sanitize what amounts to state-sanctioned execution on the high seas. And listen to the casual way he pivots from describing survivors pulled from the water to declaring, "We're putting them at the bottom of the Caribbean," and then insisting this represents the pinnacle of professional military conduct. The military knowingly targeted survivors in the water following an initial strike, deliberately killing those who remained after the first attack failed to kill everyone. This official stands before cameras defending this barbarity, as though methodical murder somehow becomes noble when dressed in the language of protocols and authorities and the laws of war. The September 20 attack killed all 11 people on board, but what he's actually describing here is something far more sinister, because Justice Department officials told prosecutors in February the administration wanted to just sink the boats, revealing an intent that preceded any individual strike by months, a premeditated policy shift toward extrajudicial killing that this administration planned from its earliest days. The sheer audacity of framing double-tap strikes as evidence of American professionalism, as though following specific processes somehow legitimizes what constitutional lawyers have called a war crime prosecuted at Nuremberg, what United Nations experts unequivocally condemned as murder, what every framework of international law recognizes as the deliberate targeting of shipwrecked survivors who pose no imminent threat. And you need to grasp the magnitude of what's unfolding here, because the Trump administration has killed more than 80 alleged drug smugglers in this months-long campaign, each death rationalized through the same linguistic gymnastics we're witnessing in this clip. The Pentagon's own Law of War Manual and Geneva Convention include provisions prohibiting conducting hostilities on the basis that there shall be no survivor, yet here we have an administration official defending exactly that practice, while invoking those very laws as justification, a perversion of legal language so complete it would be darkly comedic if it weren't resulting in scores of deaths at sea. And understand what putting them at the bottom of the Caribbean actually means in practice, because video showed survivors as 2 shirtless people clinging to the bow of a capsized and inoperable boat, drifting in the water, until missiles came and killed them. Human beings who survived an initial strike only to be deliberately targeted in a follow-up attack while incapacitated. Surveillance footage shown to lawmakers included a zoomed-in view of 2 survivors clinging to an overturned portion of the boat, meaning military personnel watched these individuals in real time, assessed their helplessness, and chose to strike again. Pentagon manuals explicitly state that orders to fire upon the shipwrecked are clearly illegal, and anyone receiving an order to leave no survivors had a duty not to follow it. Yet the entire chain of command participated in what amounts to systematic violation of the most fundamental laws of armed conflict, and this official stands here insisting they're the most professional Americans applying capabilities to deter adversaries. The ideological architecture supporting these killings reveals everything about how fascist logic embeds itself within liberal democratic institutions, because Trump formally notified Congress in October that the U.S. was in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants regarding drug cartels, unilaterally declaring a state of war that grants the executive branch authority to kill without judicial review, without congressional approval, without any of the checks supposedly fundamental to American governance. Experts, human rights groups, and international bodies said the killings were illegal under U.S. and international law, and Colombian and Venezuelan governments have accused the U.S. of extrajudicial murder, yet the Senate has twice rejected resolutions that would limit Trump's authority to continue these strikes, revealing the complicity of a legislative branch that abandoned its constitutional obligations in service to executive overreach draped in drug war rhetoric. Think about the colonial violence embedded in every syllable of putting them at the bottom of the Caribbean, the way this language casually announces dominion over an entire region, transforms international waters into an American killing field where suspected drug traffickers, notice they're always suspected, never proven, because the administration has not provided any public evidence to support assertions that boats were carrying drugs or that individuals on board were cartel members, can be executed without trial, without identification, without even the pretense of due process. Officials have acknowledged not knowing the identities of everyone on board the boats before they are struck, meaning the administration is conducting a campaign of targeted killings against anonymous individuals based solely on their presence in vessels the military deems suspicious. Colombian president identified one victim as a fisherman, Alejandro Carranza, whose family has filed a complaint saying his right to life was violated when he was wrongfully killed, revealing what human rights advocates have warned from the beginning, that without interdiction, without boarding and verification, you're not targeting drug traffickers, you're massacring civilians whose only crime was being in the wrong boat in the wrong waters at the wrong moment. The connection to Gaza isn't metaphorical, it's methodological, because scholars have described this as bringing the logic of Gaza into the Caribbean in terms of unaccountability, impunity, and an expansive notion of national defense to justify extrajudicial killing. And just as Israel conducted double-tap strikes on Nasser Hospital killing journalists and medical workers who rushed to the scene, just as Israeli intelligence data shows 83% of Palestinians killed have been civilians, the Trump administration has imported the same tactics of deliberate targeting of rescuers, the same disregard for distinction between combatants and civilians, the same rhetorical framework that labels entire categories of people as terrorists deserving summary execution. International legal scholarship argues double-tap strikes likely constitute war crimes, since they grossly violate Geneva Conventions prohibiting targeting civilians, the wounded, and those no longer able to continue fighting, yet both Israel and the United States deploy these tactics while claiming full compliance with international law, demonstrating how imperial powers simply redefine legality to accommodate whatever violence serves their geopolitical interests. And when this official contrasts current policy with catch and release in Iraq and Afghanistan, understand he's explicitly rejecting decades of interdiction practice where U.S. armed forces never used lethal force during drug operations without self-defense justification in more than 35 years of military involvement in Caribbean interdiction, where the Coast Guard interdicted drug smugglers for decades through established legal processes, where suspected traffickers were detained, prosecuted, and faced trials under established bilateral agreements. The administration abandoned this entire framework, not because it was ineffective. Previous interdiction intercepted around 4 to 6% of known maritime cocaine shipments annually, but because prosecutions require evidence, require identification, require treating suspects as human beings with rights rather than targets to be eliminated, killing all these people has eliminated human intelligence sources, causing the government's understanding of cartels, money laundering networks, and supply chains to go dark, meaning these strikes aren't even strategically sound. They're performative violence that actively undermines drug interdiction effectiveness. The bipartisan outrage emerging from Congress matters less than the structural enabling that allowed this policy to flourish in the first place, because reporting on the follow-up attack killing survivors launched Democratic accusations of war crimes and even bipartisan congressional inquiries. Yet the military's own manual cites orders to fire upon the shipwrecked as an example of a clearly illegal order. Democratic Representative Adam Smith said the order was basically to destroy the drugs and kill the 11 people on the boat, revealing that lawmakers understood the illegality from the beginning, but only mobilized serious opposition after public reporting forced their hand. Democratic Senators Schiff and Kaine sponsored a resolution to prevent further strikes without congressional approval, which failed in the Senate 51-48, demonstrating how supposedly progressive senators lacked the political courage to meaningfully constrain executive violence, even when its illegality was undeniable, even when UN experts were explicitly condemning these actions as extrajudicial executions. The deflection and blame-shifting following revelations about the September 20 double-tap reveals the pathology of authoritarian governance, because Trump and Hegseth insisted they weren't aware of what the military had done after the first strike didn't kill everyone, with Trump saying months later he had not yet been fully briefed. Yet, reporting indicates Hegseth gave a verbal order to leave no survivors, and the commander of the operation ordered a second strike to comply, and the White House declaring that Admiral Bradley, rather than Hegseth, made the decision set off a furious backlash within the Defense Department, exposing how civilian leadership attempts to escape accountability by throwing military commanders under the bus for following policies those same civilians authorized. The command culture at the Pentagon and Hegseth's obsession with lethality, and disregard for laws of armed combat led to deadly attacks and the very real possibility that war crimes have been committed. But this didn't emerge spontaneously from military culture. It flowed directly from Hegseth's philosophy that America should fight by its own rules, declaring maximum lethality, not tepid legality, in his explicit rejection of legal constraints on violence. Consider the colonial audacity of designating Latin American criminal organizations as terrorist groups subject to military strikes, because the administration alleged vessels were operated by groups including Venezuelan organization Tren de Aragua and Colombian National Liberation Army, but has not publicized any evidence for the allegations, and Venezuelan opposition figures, Trump administration sources, and independent analysts suggest the U.S.'s true motive is regime change, revealing how drug war rhetoric provides cover for interventionist foreign policy aimed at toppling governments the administration opposes. U.S. intelligence agencies concluded in declassified memos that President Maduro's government does not control Tren de Aragua, meaning the administration's entire legal justification rests on fabricated connections between targeted individuals and state actors. Yet officials say the goal is stopping drug flow, though military buildup has fueled speculation. The real aim is toppling Maduro, with the USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group arrival, significantly adding to American firepower and heightening expectations of strikes on Venezuela, transforming drug interdiction into preliminary operations for potential regime change war. The complete absence of evidence undergirding this entire campaign cannot be overstated, because there has been no documented evidence provided by the administration publicly that boats were carrying drugs, and none of the people killed were put on trial, including those who apparently could have been rescued. And fentanyl trafficking by sea would be rare and unlikely to originate from Venezuela or Colombia, as State Department reports identify Mexico as the only significant source of illicit fentanyl, meaning Trump's claims about boats loaded up with mostly fentanyl contradict his own government's intelligence assessments. The government claims killed individuals were narco-terrorists, but has provided no evidence, and interviews with victims' families indicate some had no ties to the drug trade, yet the machinery of state violence operates entirely on assertion, on designation, on the administration's word that these were legitimate targets deserving death without any verification accessible to public scrutiny or judicial review. The way this official invokes deterrence reveals how violence becomes self-justifying within imperial logic, claiming there aren't many people getting in boats right now running drugs, as though reducing boat traffic, an assertion also unverified and likely unprovable, somehow validates mass killing, as though the goal of stopping drug flow justifies any method regardless of legality or morality. But the vast majority of fentanyl and cocaine entering the U.S. is brought in from Mexico by U.S. citizens, meaning maritime interdiction addresses a marginal percentage of drug trafficking, while the administration deploys it as theater, as spectacle, as an opportunity to demonstrate American willingness to kill with impunity, while wrapping that violence in patriotic language about protecting American lives from poisoning. The cognitive dissonance required to claim you're saving American lives by executing uncharged, unidentified individuals in international waters speaks to the moral bankruptcy of drug war logic, where preventing substance use, itself a public health issue requiring treatment and harm reduction, becomes justification for extrajudicial execution thousands of miles from American shores. The systematic erosion of legal constraints enabling these strikes extends far beyond this specific operation, because the administration removed senior military lawyers from critical decision-making roles in February, and Hegseth signed a directive relaxing oversight of airstrikes and special operations, allowing commanders greater latitude without multi-layered legal vetting, deliberately dismantling the institutional safeguards meant to prevent unlawful attacks. Hegseth, as a private citizen, was a fierce advocate for soldiers charged or convicted of war crimes, lobbying Trump to grant clemency to Eddie Gallagher, who stabbed and killed an injured 17-year-old Iraqi, and defending Matthew Goldstein and Clint Lawrence, who were charged with murder, revealing someone whose entire ideological orientation celebrates military violence freed from legal constraint, who views rules of engagement and laws of armed conflict as obstacles to American power rather than necessary limits on state violence. This isn't aberration. It's the logical endpoint of militarism married to white supremacist nationalism that views brown and black lives in the global South as expendable in service to American security theater. International condemnation has been universal and unequivocal, with foreign experts condemning the extrajudicial execution of people when the U.S. sank vessels, stating international law does not allow governments to simply murder alleged drug traffickers, with Rana High Commissioner for Human Rights stating more than 60 people killed in circumstances that find no justification in international law, with former ICC chief prosecutor calling the strikes crimes against humanity, stating it's murder and there is no clarity why these people are not civilians, even though they could be criminals. Yet American exceptionalism operates through complete imperviousness to international law, through the assumption that what applies to other nations somehow doesn't bind the United States. The United Kingdom stopped sharing intelligence about suspected drug trafficking vessels because it does not want to be complicit in strikes it believes are illegal, demonstrating how even close American allies recognize the lawlessness of this campaign and refuse participation. Yet the administration continues unabated, conducting strikes. Even a Colombian president called attacking boat occupants rather than capturing them murder and announced suspending intelligence sharing. The broader implications for international order are catastrophic, because these airstrikes set a dangerous precedent that might encourage China to use drug smuggling as pretext to bomb Taiwanese fishing vessels or lead other countries to execute foreigners without trial, sending a clear message that the United States flouts international law because it can. Dismantling the very frameworks of international humanitarian law that American officials invoke when condemning adversaries. A state may not assist another state in violating international law, yet the United States demands cooperation from regional partners while conducting operations those partners increasingly recognize as illegal, wielding its military and economic power to compel complicity in what amounts to an ongoing campaign of extrajudicial execution, masquerading as drug interdiction. This is how empires operate in their declining phases, through increasingly naked exercises of violence, stripped of even the pretense of legal justification, through the substitution of raw power for legitimacy, through the insistence that might makes right even as that philosophy corrodes whatever moral authority the state once claimed. Listen again to this official speak and recognize you're witnessing the banality of evil in its most articulate form, the smooth bureaucratic language that transforms murder into operations, that converts human beings into targets, that describes deliberate killing of survivors as adherence to protocols, and understand that every institution designed to prevent this, Congress, courts, military legal structures, international bodies, has either been circumvented or has actively collaborated in normalizing state violence against vulnerable populations in the global South. There is no credible basis by which Trump's military campaign against Latin American drug vessels is lawful under either U.S. or international law, yet it continues, will likely continue, because these attacks have become routine with military forces remaining in place and the policy expanding over time, because no domestic constituency advocates for unnamed brown and black bodies in distant waters, because the political calculation favors appearing tough on drugs over respecting human rights or international law. The fight against this requires more than outrage. It demands systematic resistance to the ideological framework enabling these killings, rejection of the drug war paradigm that treats substance use as justifying military intervention, dismantling the bipartisan consensus around American exceptionalism and military primacy, building solidarity with Latin American nations and peoples targeted by this violence, and recognizing that the techniques perfected in the War on Terror, the unilateral designation of enemy combatants, the classified legal memos justifying expanded executive authority, the invocation of imminent threats to bypass normal legal processes, have now been imported wholesale into drug policy with devastating consequences. Human Rights Watch calls for immediately halting any plans for future unlawful strikes and demands. Congress open prompt and transparent investigation into decision-making processes including legal rationale and chain of command. But meaningful accountability requires political will that remains absent from a legislative branch that has twice voted against constraining these operations, that continues appropriating funds for military operations in the Caribbean, that treats extrajudicial killing as legitimate counter-narcotic strategy rather than criminal enterprise. This is what fascism looks like wrapped in professionalism, draped in flag and country, articulated through the language of law, while systematically violating every principle those laws ostensibly protect. And the fact that it unfolds in international waters rather than American streets does not make it less alarming, less urgent, less deserving of total opposition from everyone claiming to value human rights, international law, or basic human decency, because the logic that says we can put them at the bottom of the Caribbean without trial, without evidence, without accountability, is the same logic that will eventually justify similar violence anywhere the state deems necessary, and if we accept this, if we allow this to be normalized as professional military operations rather than recognized as the systematic campaign of extrajudicial execution that it clearly is, then we've surrendered not just international law, but the very possibility of constraining state violence through legal and moral norms, and that surrender will haunt, not just the families of those killed in Caribbean waters, but anyone who might someday find themselves designated as threats to American interests deserving elimination, without trial, without appeal, put at the bottom of whatever sea or desert or neighborhood the state decides is beyond the reach of justice.